The first emperor of Rome is Octavius Thoroughness. Before Octavius became an emperor, Rome was a republic headed by Julius Caesar, who got assassinated by members of the Senate after he declared himself dictator for life. Octavius then joined a coalition with Caesar's old allies, Mark Antony and Mark Lepidus. Together they defeated Caesar's assassins, but the coalition became unstable as Octavius and Antony were rivals. This led to a series of battles, which ended up with the defeat of Antony's army, compelling him to commit suicide. Octavius then fired Lepidus, changed his own name to Augustus Caesar, and gave himself the title of Principate, which means first citizen, so he could finally become emperor of Rome. As Rome's first emperor, Augustus sought to create a stable empire surrounded by defensible borders. Therefore, he sent legions to expand the empire towards the Danube and Elbe rivers, of which the Romans had reached the Danube, but 3 legions were destroyed near the Elbe, which stopped Roman expansion into Germania. Nevertheless, within the empire, Augustus created a Praetorian Guard to serve as the private bodyguard and secret police for the emperors. He also commissioned many building projects around the empire, of which he had claimed to have turned Rome from a city of bricks to marble. As Augustus was getting old, he planned to leave his empire to his 2 grandsons, but they died, so he ended up with his general Tiberius as his successor. But when Tiberius came to power, the Rhine legions started a mutiny. Therefore, Tiberius sent his nephew Germanicus to quell the mutiny, but Germanicus used the legions to launch several campaigns into Germania. When Tiberius realized that Germanicus' popularity was becoming a threat, Tiberius claimed that the campaigns wasted a lot of resources, so Germanicus was sent to Syria, where he died under mysterious circumstances. Later on, Tiberius became fed up with the job and isolated himself to Capri, leaving things to his Praetorian prefect Sejanus. However, Sejanus used his position to kill and purge his own rivals, and then he planned to kill Tiberius. So when Tiberius discovered a plot against him, he had Sejanus assassinated. Tiberius then further decreased his popularity by becoming paranoid and started purging people by creating treason trials. So when Tiberius got sick, news spread across the empire that Tiberius died. Many people cheered, with some demanding that Tiberius should be thrown into the Tiber River. However, when it turned out that Tiberius wasn't dead, one of his guards suffocated him to death, and Germanicus' son Caligula became emperor. Caligula then stopped the treason trials and decreased taxes. He also spent a large amount of money on games, donatives, and buildings, so he became widely loved across the empire. When he got sick, many people begged the gods for his recovery, but when he recovered, people started to notice that he became nuts. When he found out his expenditures had drained the treasury, he increased taxes and created new treason trials so he could arrest people and confiscate their property. Caligula also made preparations to invade the island of Britain, but instead declared war on Neptune and ordered his men to collect seashells as war spoils. He even threatened to make his favorite horse a Roman consul. Eventually, Caligula got assassinated, and a brief moment of chaos erupted in the city as the guards tried to hunt down the assassins. Along the way, the guards find a man hiding behind some curtains and drag him out against his will. They identified him as Caligula's uncle Claudius and proclaimed him emperor. Due to Claudius' jerky movements and speech impediment, he was often mocked for his disabilities, including from his own mother. However, his reign was pretty successful as Rome had conquered and annexed many states around the empire. Claudius also undertook a large project to reduce food shortages by draining the Fucine Lake, but that ended in disaster, so he created a new harbor near Rome. Claudius also had a pretty disastrous marriage life. He betrothed a woman who died on the wedding day. His next wife was divorced for adultery. His third wife was so promiscuous, she won a contest against a prostitute on who can have sex with the most men in a day. She also married another man and plotted to overthrow Claudius, but she was caught and executed. His last wife killed him, so she could rule the empire through her son Nero. Nero and his mother ruled the empire for a couple good years until the relationship became hostile. After many disagreements regarding Nero's lifestyle and affairs, Nero deprived his mother of her bodyguards, exiled her from the imperial palace, and secretly sent assassins to kill her. Nero's assassins had poisoned her several times, set up elaborate booby traps in her room, and even put her into a ship and sunk it. But despite all these attempts, she survived, so eventually they just decided to stab her to death. Afterwards, Nero's excessive spending on art patronage and building projects had drained the treasury, so Nero increased taxes and purged many wealthy landowners for their estates. But in July of 64, Rome had caught on fire. Nero had gave massive relief efforts for the displaced Romans, but some people suspected he burned Rome to make room for his golden palace, so Nero tried to put the blame on Christians and had them publicly burned. Eventually, a governor named Julius Vindex would rebel against Nero and pronounce a general named Galba as emperor, but this rebellion was crushed. However, the rebellion allowed Galba's legions to march on Rome and overthrow Nero. Nero then ran away and committed suicide, and Galba made himself emperor of Rome. Many of the soldiers thought having Galba as the new emperor was a good idea until he became emperor. Any punishment to crime was excessively severe. He brought back the practice of decimation, and his methods to recover the treasury became unpopular. Many soldiers were also disgruntled because they expected bonuses for taking part in the rebellion, of which Galba refused to pay. Galba was old when he became emperor, so he was looking for a replacement. In Thrace, a man named Otho received the prophecy that he would become emperor, so he spent large sums of money to flatter Galba and other Roman officials. Meanwhile in the Rhine, the legions were in revolt and pronounced their own emperor named Vitellius. Galba then announced that a noble named Piso as the next emperor, which did not go well for Otho. So Otho bribed some of the Praetorian Guard who were also dismayed by Galba, and they killed both Galba and Piso. When the Rhine legions heard of Galba's death, they decided to march on Rome anyways. Otho responded with his own army, but he was defeated, so he committed suicide. Meanwhile in the east, a general named Vespasian was on the process of crushing a Jewish revolt when he suddenly felt like he needed a throne. So he sent an army to Rome, leaving his son Titus to crush the revolt. Vespasian's forces defeated Vitellius' army, and Vitellius tried to run away before he was captured and killed. By this time, the imperial treasury had been considerably depleted, so Vespasian had created new taxes around the empire, including one in public urinals. Vespasian also had Titus as the Praetorian prefect who would arrest and execute anyone that was a threat to his rule. But when Titus objected to the urinal tax, Vespasian lifted his coins to him and asked, "See my son if they have any smell." Vespasian reigned a good 10 years before he died, leaving Titus as emperor. However, because of Titus's previous position, many people braced themselves for another terrible emperor. Instead, Titus turned out to be a very generous emperor. He abolished the treason trials and spent a large amount of money on relief efforts after a volcano erupted near Pompeii. He even stripped decorations from his own mansion to redecorate damaged public buildings. His reign actually started out pretty good, but he got sick and died only after 2 years of rule, leaving the empire to Domitian. Domitian spent his time meticulously micromanaging his empire. He frequently monitors tribunals to prevent bribery and corruption, set up requirements for silver content and coins to manage their value, and issued edicts to improve food production. Domitian also hated the Senate, and they hated him. He didn't understand why he needed to seek their approval from a bunch of rich aristocrats when he could rule the empire himself. So he shunned the Senate, but he increased soldiers' pay to gain their loyalty instead. He also had to face a few incursions from the Chatti and Dacian tribes, so he responded with a few punitive expeditions but ended up in a very brutal and inconclusive campaign, so he settled to pay them off to stop them from attacking. Meanwhile in Rome, Domitian's differences with the Senate had resulted in numerous assassination attempts which made him paranoid, so he executed a lot of people, even the ones in his own entourage, which exacerbated the situation. Eventually he got cornered and stabbed to death. The Senate then thrusted Nerva into becoming emperor, who pardoned the assassins until a Praetorian Guard mutinied and took him as hostage until he allowed them to kill assassins. Nerva was very old when he came to power, so he needed to pick a successor who was popular with the army to prevent himself from being overthrown. He found a governor named Trajan, who agreed to become emperor. Nerva then spent the rest of his reign trying to appease the population with economic reforms, donations, and tax cuts. But the only thing he'd be really remembered for is the guy who picked Trajan. During the peace with the Dacians had spent Roman money building fortifications against the Roman Empire, so when Trajan became emperor, he attacked and annexed their territory, thus capturing their gold mines. He then used the imperial wealth to build more roads, buildings, and welfare programs, but most of all, he built a giant column to celebrate his triumph. Afterwards, Rome had faced problems in the buffer state of Armenia when the Parthians set up a king that was unsatisfactory to Rome. So Trajan attacked and conquered large parts of Parthian territory, but the Jews had created an uprising which complicated the Roman conquest of Parthia. When Trajan died of an illness, the next emperor, named Hadrian, returned the conquered territories to Parthia so he could crush the Jewish revolt. Hadrian then traveled all around the empire and constructed many buildings, including a giant wall. He also brought the beard back in fashion and made love to his gay friend Antonius, who had later drowned to death, so Hadrian ordered the construction of an entire city dedicated to him. Hadrian also tried to rebuild Jerusalem but named it Ali Capitonina, and built a temple for Jupiter instead of Yahweh, which sparked another Jewish revolt which had to be brutally crushed again. He ruled for a good 21 years before he died. Hadrian left his position to Antoninus Pius, whose reign was most notable for the lack of any large-scale wars or other forms of extreme violence. Antoninus became highly praised for his good conduct and patronages, as well as sensible legal reforms, thus he had a relatively peaceful reign for a good 23 years before he died. The emperorship then passed on to Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, who would rule as co-emperors of Rome. The Parthians decided to test these new emperors and attacked both Armenia and Syria. Marcus then sent Lucius to deal with the Parthians, but Lucius decided to relax in his summer home near Antioch while the generals campaigned against the Parthians, of which they've managed to beat back the Parthians and sack their capital, but when they returned, they brought the plague with them, which killed Lucius and depopulated much of the empire. The opportunist Marcomanni then took advantage of this and attacked the Romans, but they ended up with the plague before being defeated by Marcus. Marcus then settled the defeated Marcomanni into the empire to fill in depopulated areas. He ruled for a troubled 20 years before he died, leaving the empire to his son Commodus. Before Marcus died, he had tried to raise Commodus to be an emperor, but Commodus was not interested in ruling the empire. Instead, he was addicted to gladiatorial games and even participated in the games himself. He neglected imperial rule and instead had unscrupulous people rule the empire for him while he ride around the Colosseum killing animals and beating cripples to death. He was later strangled to death in his bath and replaced by Pertinax, who was proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard. From this point on, the Roman Empire would start becoming increasingly militarized, and instability would eventually engulf the empire as the generals would later find out how easy it was to become an emperor. Despite these many obstacles, bouts of stability would return as the empire still continued to exist for another 1,000 years.